So I'll just briefly, it sounds like everyone's got the code now, so I'm going to briefly talk about the context for it and why we've chosen to draw it with hexagons and why bounding contexts are now starting to make a difference to some choices we make in our code. So I'll just briefly run you through this. So in the code you should basically have two Java projects, two Maven projects. One is web and the other one is core. So this is probably the simplest boilerplate that you could come up with for a hexagonal arrangement without any of the other external ports in there. So we've just got this in the middle, which is a core, and web at the top. So web here has a session. So the reason why I've drawn, excited. So the reason why I've drawn the word session there under the web project is we know that the customer is going to come in through a browser and they're going to start to go through the process of applying for the account, and they're either going to abandon that session or they're going to have that session aborted for them because it's timed out. The problem we have is that in the centre, so this is the domain in the centre of the hexagon. Does everyone sort of get this hexagonal arrangement here to sort of understand why that's drawn the way it is? It's not as common as we think sometimes, but basically all of the ideas we talked about in all the domain-driven design talk about customers, prospects and applicants and things like that would normally go in the centre here. And on the outside, we've got a number of bounded contexts on the wider, sort of in the wider sense. So this is in the sort of application architecture sense. These are all bounded contexts that are going to affect the way that we implement it. So the first thing we know about is that we need to send an email. So that's in the SMTP port. We know we've got a session that the customer is bound to on the website, and we know we need to send a reminder. But we don't have any representation in the domain of a session. And that's something that we wouldn't normally do, because you'd normally say, well, it's HTTP, it's a browser, it's the bounding context is HTTP or HTTPS. Why on earth would we ever put a session in the domain? Yeah, it doesn't seem to belong in the domain, the idea of a session.
Well, you don't mean session in the web session sense.
Correct. Yeah. So session here, because it's in the web port and the web port, is definitely a HTTP session. So that will have a 10-minute expiry or whatever. And we know that when that session gets cleared out of the cache or whatever, that customer journey is over. But what we don't have is a way of expressing that in here. All we have is a controller. In the code we have a controller which I think just takes customer details. You take the customer, attempts to verify the customer. We have no idea of session, but there's no reason why we shouldn't have an idea of session in the domain. I think I mentioned this to a few people before. That if you bring in the idea of there being an admin portal that's used on floor 2 of the organisation, where they can go in and eject people from the account opening procedure by invalidating the session. Or if you go down to the branch down here, this is the high street. So that's boundary context, that's the high street. That's someone at their laptop, that's someone on the high street. They still do exactly the same thing. The person walking into the branch on the high street, wanting to open an account, begins a session with a human being. And that person may need to abandon that session to go and catch a train or something like that. So there's no reason why we shouldn't express the idea of a session in the core business domain.
And presumably the timeout is technology dependent. I mean, if they're doing this by snail mail,
Yes.
A 10-minute timeout isn't going to be very useful.
True. Yes. So when well, that's interesting because if you have session abandoned there and the reminder's bound to email, then if this is coming through the branch, then what would the reminder be? Would it be if they send a text message or something like that? What would they do? So there were two things about the bounding context, the web bounding context, that are going to prevent you from trying to do something nice in the code to solve this problem. So the third part of the title of this thing was to do with object-oriented design. And one of the things that we'd like to do is do more of a tell, don't ask type of style in object-oriented, in our object-oriented chosen language.
Sorry, can I?
Yeah.
Presumably one reason for not having session in your domain might be if the word doesn't mean anything to your business.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
If they look at your squiggly eye.
Exactly. So that central hexagon is also considered a neutral bounding context. So it's not really bound, it's just a domain context. It's not bound to any technological forces at all, strictly speaking, in domain-driven design. It's only when you start to bring in the other functions of the business. So the business operates on email, and there's an SMTP server. So you're plugging a port in here to say, yes, emails can be sent out from this business. And when are they sent out? Well, a reminder. And the business has an idea of a reminder. It's in the documentation, it's even in the introductions to the customer when they're going through the customer sign-up procedure. You know, it tells them that we sent a reminder. These two are interesting though, branch and admin portal. Again, completely separate bounded contexts. The branch context is bound by things like opening hours and being able to get transport to go to the branch, things like that. So this is a very wide-ranging view. This is not a sort of implementation view of an hexagonal architecture. This is very, very much more abstract, I think. The only technological thing going on here is web and SMTP. The other two are there to illustrate that the idea of a session is completely valid to the business. It's in all the business literature when it comes to when they talk about bringing a customer onto to create a new account. They always talk about the session and how important it is that the session is completed and it's not aborted by the customer. Because if the session is aborted by the customer, then it could indicate there's a problem with the customer signing up. Why are they leaving the process?
Real banks use that word, session.
No, not that I know of. Not that I know of, not at all, no. I haven't seen anything like that in any of the...
Don't talk about application.
Yeah, something like that, yes. I mean, so it's a little bit contrived, that word, I totally agree. And you could possibly say that HTTP session is well, what is HTTP session? What else could it be called in terms of...
It's more of a visitor.
Yeah, I think by the time they come up here and they start a session, they're a visitor. The session started. They just so happen to be a visitor to the web portal. But they could be a visitor to the branch. They could be a visitor to the call centre. They could be calling through to open an account. And the call centre application uses very much the same sort of sign-up process. Integrates with the same services and so on and so forth.
Could you call it a visit? Rather than...
Yeah, maybe something like that, yeah. It's, so that's all up for grabs, and I think what domain-driven design is quite good at doing is when you don't draw any of the outer hexagons here at all, you completely forget about those, but you start to talk to your business in terms of their core domain and visit the different functions of the business and talk about, you know, collaborating with them. So earlier we talked about there being a customer due diligence section. So that might actually be, in this example here, the customer due diligence feature might be a call out to a completely different system over here that deals with verifying the customer. Having a ports and adapters arrangement on this still would be quite useful because you'd have, in the centre here, you'd have a verify command which would take a customer, you fire off that command, and the port here would ensure that that gets sent to the customer due diligence platform through data integration or whatever, and return with a success or a fail. So the example in the code that you can see there is imposing a bounded context on you. That means you can't do some of the things that you would normally like to do in terms of object-oriented style. There's a particular style of called tell don't ask, and the code that you're seeing here will make it very difficult for you to achieve that, simply because the bounded context has already decided that you're in webland. So you can't, it's stateless. You can't bring in private fields without worrying about thread safety, things like that. So even though these are wildly different bounded contexts, that simple bounded context of web, so in the code it's just the bound web, I think that's what it is in the project, and that's the bound core. As soon as you bring that in, you're stuck. You can't make the call to the core domain that you'd like to make with a tell don't ask arrangement. There are two callbacks that you'd like to be able to make. One is to say the session's abandoned, and the other one is to say that the customer's been verified. If you look at the code. But that's going to be really hard for you to do that if you're in the web bounded context. So the bounded context has already decided that you can't do some of those things that you want to do. So we must have all hit at some point the problem of working with a controller in MVC where the controller has to be thread safe and stateless. We all sort of hit that kind of issue before. Yeah. The problem here, of course, is that the controller is our way into, it's our port into the core business domain of taking the customer through an application. So you're starting a session, you'd like to invoke some core business logic, business domain logic with commands and queries and all the rest of it. But you're already stuck with the fact that the entry point into your application is the HTTP bounded context. And the HTTP bounded context says you've got to be stateless, you can't be, you're not going to be thread safe. So how can we solve that problem in the code? Anyone got any ideas? He's got some ideas. There's a way of doing it that well, I don't want to spoil it, but it's sort of answered there in the final thing. But so, anyone any ideas where to go from here with that controller code? Anything we can do to?
If you've got an actor framework, it becomes sliced.
Yeah. So what does that code give you? The stateless?
I mean actors in general.
Oh, sorry, actors in general.
Actor framework.
Okay, so that's a possible.
In the sense that you've got something that maybe represents that session, that visit, that customer even.
Yeah.
Which is kind of, can be slightly more long-lived than that individual sort of interaction of just generating a web response. So maybe you pass a message to that entity.
So I think that's getting closer to the solution that I've been thinking about. But I'd like to hear from the group about their experiences with being faced with the web bounded context. So we've talked about lots of different bounded contexts here tonight, but really the one that we know we hit more often than any other is usually the web bounded context. It's all the HTTP mechanisms that we have to deal with, responses, requests, and all that kind of thing.
So are you talking about persisting a session in a database or something like that to retrieve it?
Well, I think it could become very, very complicated very, very quickly. You could start decoupling everything and make it sort of like event-based, and store and pick up later sort of thing. But I'm wondering if there's a better way of doing that.
I must admit, coming from ASP.net, I haven't understood what the problem is that you're trying to solve.
All right.
I don't either.
I get the impression that not many people do actually. The reason for that is probably because I haven't explained it. What we're trying to do here is to not really, okay, so we're not really solving a problem as such, because I don't think these problems are the actor framework, for example, or those that are working in Play or Akka, they probably don't have these issues at all. Or people working in Node probably don't hit these issues because it's synchronous and single-threaded. Yeah?
So, I mean, in ASP.net, every user on the website they'll get, effectively you can write your code as if there was just a single user.
Yeah.
And another user will maybe run the same code but in a different thread, and you don't need to worry about it.
Yeah.
So is that an answer to the question?
Yeah. So there is a similar kind of thing you can do in, I think in ASP.NET, and I think the MVC actually is more along the lines of the session-based instance variables, things like that.
Could you go into more detail about the problem and what happens and what goes wrong?
Is it when the visitor goes away? Is that the thing? That essentially it's one thing, generate a response to somebody when they interact with you, but the question of how do you do something when somebody's no longer interacting with you is kind of out. You sort of slip outside that.
Yeah. So if you look at the controller declaration and the interfaces that I've decided to stick on there, they are role definitions. So they're interfaces as roles that have been taken straight out of the domain. So they're all about identity and session. So they're not necessarily something that you would pick straight out of the framework, the HTTP framework or anything like that. So I've invented a couple of interfaces there that are very business-like. Because as soon as I come in through this port, I want to get to the really valuable stuff of the business domain as soon as I can. It's ports and adapters, so that web port should be come in with a HTTP request, grab what you can, invoke some commands or fire off some queries, and then get out and just let go of it because it's completely stateless. But the example here is I find examples like this quite difficult to solve. Because with domain-driven design, the domain-driven design idea is getting you to work with domain ideas much quicker than you would do normally. So as soon as you're in the controller is actually taken on a role. Can someone remind what the interface role is on there?
You've got visitor and identity.
Yeah. So you've got the controller's actually taking on two interfaces.
They shouldn't be there at all because you're in an adapter here.
Yes.
You're not in the domain core, so you shouldn't have any business logic.
Well, that's what I'm trying to get away from is how do we express some of the business domain in that controller, but don't get tied to the core interfaces or anything like that. So there's got to be a way of making use of core domain ideas like these interfaces, but not being sort of stuck with the HTTP bounding context and it completely screwing up your asynchronous, your idea for doing it asynchronously, or responding with a session, waiting, maybe persisting and then calling back later, that kind of thing. So this is just an example of where a bounded context has decided that you have to work with those tools. So you're in HTTP land. So what would you do? Would you get straight out of the HTTP bounded context and go straight into the domain as quickly as you could? Or would there be some stepping stone to take you into that? Would there be another type of object that would take you in from the bounded context and translate across to the domain and then kick off the commands and queries that you need?
I mean, the typical thing, I think ASP.NET MVC for the last few years has been writing controls almost that you can look at the control code and not even notice it's from a website because that is sufficiently abstracted away And you can almost go straight into your domain code.
Yeah.
You might not want to.
Yeah.
So yes, so my reflex reaction, if I've understood your question, is either A, I'd want my framework to abstract away the webness of the web bit,
Yes.
or B, the only thing my web code is going to do is immediately be a pass-through respectively to some other class that is then in the business domain.
Right, so is that
that
would be the preferable way of doing it? So let me put the last slide on, because this is the problem that I find with things like this, is that traditionally stateless web protocols, they impose this sort of constraint on you. So if you're starting to build a controller that wants to start to interact with the domain, you can't get to things like tell, don't ask. This is a very specific problem of wanting to get to tell, don't ask. So you're asking your controller to take on a role so that when it's passed into the domain, it can be called back on. So the domain can call back and say, yes, the customer's been verified. The controller can complete its action and set a cookie or something like that. And the other example in the code is where it's saying to the controller, when I call back to you and I say, challenge the identity of the caller into this domain, set the response code to 401. Because when you come out of the domain with a challenge to the identity of the caller, the controller should translate that as a 401 back to the browser. If you look at the example in the code, is this an example of where bounded contexts really work against you at the code level? Because it looks at all the bounded contexts for the business. Is this something that people see, or is this not a very common example? Or
coming from a .NET background, the idea of a controller implementing a domain models, I didn't notice it at first because I never thought you could do that. It's a totally alien concept.
yes.
You say that's a bad concept anyway.
Well, I don't know. What it's trying to do is set up some interfaces so it can be called back as soon as possible. So it can make its call to the domain, pass itself in, but it only goes in as the interface, obviously, because it's laid down. And the call back to the interface is, yes, I verified the customer. You can safely set that cookie and respond to the browser. So, are there other ways of doing this that take us away from this sort of constraint that the HTTP bounded context has put on us, but still allows us to use the domain? Because domain-driven design is trying to say, look, the domain is central to everything you do. We don't particularly care if you're coming in through a web portal. If you're trying to validate a customer, get away from the HTTP ideas as soon as you can, get into the domain, fire off a command that's to do with validating the customer, and respond. How you respond back to the browser, the domain really doesn't care about that. The domain just wants to say, yes, the customer is verified, or the customer isn't verified. What does the browser respond with? Sorry, what does the controller respond with?
In my mind, I mean, that's the role of the controller,
Yeah.
is to be the adapter between
Yeah.
what the domain is and concerns of the web.
Yes.
That should be its sort of sole role. So it
Yeah.
figures out what the meaning is in the inbound request in the context of the domain and sort of sends it the appropriate command or query,
Yeah.
respectively.
Is that the idea that you were thinking of, Tony?
What I do is I have the controller create a command object that lives in the domain,
Mm-hmm.
pass it the incoming parameters from the request,
Yeah.
so that the command can validate those parameters and then do whatever it likes to the domain. The controller also passes in a bunch of code blocks, lambdas, whatevers, and says each one of these represents what I want to do in one of the possible outcome scenarios.
Right. So it's not. So it's a kind of callback.
It's a kind of callback, but without using interfaces.
Okay. That's exactly the solution that I was hoping to hear, because what we've done is we've imposed interfaces, we've imposed domain ideas onto the controller, and we don't need to do that. All we need to do is provide some behaviours, are these like adapting behaviours? So these behaviours that are all about adapting the responses in the HTTP context.
So
These little lambdas and stuff.
the way I think of it is the command object will arrive at a conclusion.
Yeah.
And that conclusion will be, yeah, I've done that, or no, I couldn't do that for this reason, or no, I couldn't do that for this reason. And there might be a whole list of couldn't do that.
Yes.
And for each one of those, the controller supplies a parcelled up piece of behaviour for that command to execute on its behalf.
So I think that's a really good alternative to this kludgy idea that we've got. Just what the controller here tries to do is steal domain ideas and pass itself into the domain. The idea here is a bit like promises. It feels like promises what you're doing. Is that similar to the idea of promises and rejections and things like that? They're blocks of code that get run when...
They're not promises because they're executed synchronously.
Right.
So, but they're not objects, they're
Right.
functions. So it's functional OO.
Is that kind of sometimes you've come across the idea of sometimes called railroad-oriented programming, where you've almost got a success path and a kind of error path, and promises are an example of that, generally asynchronously, but you use the idea more generally where you've kind of got, this is the happy path, this chain of actions, but at any point you can kind of deviate into a kind of unhappy path.
Right. So what I wanted to do when I started this skeleton for the bank is start with one use case, which was getting the customer verified, and use the smallest number of ideas from the domain, and then give the controller all the action to do. So the controller has all the behaviour to implement. But the wrong thing to do was to give the controller the interfaces and expect it to implement those behaviours. This way around, because this way around you get completely away from the problem of multi-threaded, synchronous, stateful controllers.
But also the code stays in the right places. All the domain stuff is in one place,
Yes.
and all the web stuff is in another place. I'll tweet around a blog post I wrote about 3 years ago, solving this exact problem for web controllers.
This is exactly right.
So if you look out for hashtag XPMan, I'll send that out later on.
Yeah,
And
brilliant.
that's Rails,
It's Rails, right?
which makes it worse.
So what we're doing with this code, actually the company I work for at the moment, we're actually building this fake bank as a sort of experiment. I'll be doing this myself, because what I've seen is every single financial organisation I've been to has had all of these bounded contexts thrown at it. You know, it's having to deal with mail servers, with call centres, with different functions of the business, and very little of that has been expressed in plain context-free domain code. So just plain Java objects, plain C# objects, whatever, with no context imposed on it, no sort of HTTP context or no persistence context imposed on it. And I'll be building this example. I'll keep this example going now, and I'll just keep adding to it. When I visit the next place, I'll add another idea on there, like anti-money laundering or something like that. There's an idea out there called the Open Banking Standard. So what I've started here is, which I did just to illustrate this one example and to show you the bounded context stuff. We'll carry on now, and we'll probably implement this this pattern of yours to see whether it works. The reason I did it in Java, I didn't particularly want to do it in Java, because it's not my first language, but I knew the group was more Java, usually more Java oriented. That's what I found recently, so that's why it's in Java. So feel free to carry on contributing to this.
Just a quick show of hands, who is Java oriented in here? Thank you.
Oh, it's not. It's a lot less than I
C
thought.
Sharp, Ruby,
Cheating.
JavaScript. There you go.
Wow, I thought it was Java. I thought it was mostly Java. Well, there you go. So,
No future.
yes, yeah. Also, I mean, I work with quite a lot of Java developers, and they like to see examples like this.
This is hard to do if you haven't got Java 8.
That was the other thing. Yes, that was the other thing that has come up
You got
recently.
it to build.
We get these problems all the time because we're on Java 7, and a lot of our developers tend to have a whinge about it, and then the architects say, well, what are you whinging about? You've got everything you need in Java 7, and when they say things like lambdas, they just kind of have a little laugh about it, as if it's not that important. But is what you're saying that these things are actually quite important to solve these problems of having boundary context?
Lambdas give you a way of passing around little snippets of functionality without going to all the trauma of having to create a class.
Trauma.
And there's an interesting talk by Rich Hickey called Simple Made Easy,
Yeah.
which he talks about avoidable complexity. And one of the examples of that he gives is methods in OO bind together function, state, and identity.
Yes.
And sometimes all you want is function.
I'd argue sort of along that thread.
Can you ignore that?
It's valuable, even if it's something you never go back to try solving some of these problems with functional language, which is increasingly my kind of approach to these things. But I think, if nothing else, it makes you realise how many ideas you've stitched together as being necessary and being intrinsically kind of the same idea along that lines. And maybe you sort of unpick them and they're put together a different way in the functional language on those concepts, and maybe you never go back and solve the problem that way in real life, but it just kind of unpicks the
Even in an object-oriented language, most of my best code is functional.
Well, I hit this problem quite a lot. I've left Java and C# for about a year and did a lot of Node, and I didn't hit these problems where these different persistence context or HTTP context were really, I was finding it difficult to deal with. And then I read this article called Promises Are Imperative, Callbacks are imperative and promises are functional. And it's kind of getting to these kind of solutions. So one of the reasons I wanted to bring the boundary context stuff to you tonight is that most of the domain-driven design stuff that I talk to people about, I'm not learning, it seems to stall. A lot of people aren't getting into domain-driven design, and I'm not learning very much now about it. And I've actually learned something tonight about how someone solved a problem with boundary context that I hadn't seen before. And that's completely changed my view of that now.
Java has a promises library as well.
Yeah. So these kinds of things that I need to. So that's brilliant. I mean, I've learned something from that. In terms of domain-driven design, I don't know where to go with it now because everything that I do with it is not that impressive anymore in terms of implementation. Most organisations don't want to make the investment into building these kinds of systems. I think they prefer having this tiered approach where services call services, and the Java classes are literally just methods with loads of business logic in them. Yeah, so the business logic is spread throughout services, which actually is a domain-driven design idea, but it's been abused, I think, and that's the sad thing. So I've learned a lot over the years about that as well.
Going back to that conference we went to this year, it was around microservices and DDD, and first talk was by Eric explaining, so doing that balls of mud and the German, the French man in the room. Second was somebody trying to talk about documenting your code, having self-documenting code, and it was all in Java and everything. Another guy was talking about something else, and then the third one came on and he was explaining how he's using F# to do domain-driven design. and microservices, and it just blew everything else out. And just all the problems everybody had and all the pain they'd just been showing you to go through, the F# stuff just went, no, you don't need that, mate, it's done. So that shows me that
it could be. I think a lot of the ideas that we have about making the domain central to what we do, and then when you spread out and you hit these things like MVC controllers, they just seem to be running so against the grain. And the developers very often are very disheartened by this, and they just think, oh, I can't do this anymore.
Especially, it's such an impedance mismatch between
the
web and object oriented.
Exactly,
yeah. It is functional, that layer, if nothing else, even if your domain you choose to express for something more stable.
So I've learned something really valuable then, that the boundary context problem that I've seen countless times in countless teams seems to be solvable with functional style, or at least
solvable is probably strong. I think it's stupid to imply that something makes all the problems go away.
Yeah, agree.
It changes the focus so that some problems become simple and other things become head scratches, and then maybe having tried both focuses, you can kind of choose the right approach at the right time.
Right.
For my money, I find I tend to use, when I'm starting a personal project, I use Elixir the last couple of years, which is basically ELO. So you've got functional and you've also got actors. And for me, that kind of blends the two fairly well, because your actors are kind of persistent things and you message between them, and you put inside them use a functional style. For me, I find that covers off quite a few problems, although other things which were easy become
so we'll have to wrap up a little bit. Has anyone else noticed the crossover between, the other thing I wanted to mention was mentioned in the earlier slides, the crossover between CQRS, hexagonal architecture and domain-driven design, and all the complementary sort of patterns that seem to fit together. Has anybody else noticed this? I mean, these problems seem to be solved more by event sourcing, for example, than anything else.
I would do this with CQRS rather than a single domain model that attempts to handle queries and commands. Never feels right anymore.
No, it doesn't. It seems like, so this example here, which is just one core package, it won't be long before that's split into about 4 or 5 different distributed packages. Would they be distributed behind smaller services? Is that what you're suggesting? Sort of
you've got the choice then.
Microservices or something, yeah. So has anybody else had experience with CQRS and event sourcing and then hit these kinds of systems like this and thought, yeah, I could solve those problems with CQRS and event sourcing? Because almost everything I hit now, especially when I'm doing more domain-driven design stuff, is just everything seems to be more event-based than it was about 5 years ago. But why is that happening? Why is so much of that happening now?
As a fit to the domain.
Yeah. So any more questions about the business side of domain-driven design that I introduced earlier, the strategic and tactical stuff? Because what I think we'll find now is as I'll keep building this as a little project of my own, and I'll start putting web front end to it and stuff like that. And if you want to join in, learn something about that, and just join the repo.
So kind of about that one.
Yeah.
The title doesn't quite, on that slide, doesn't quite make sense to me because
this one here. Yeah.
Because I assume that bounded context means a business domain.
Oh right.
Context.
Oh no. When I'm thinking bounded context in this way, I'm thinking I'm completely bound by web technologies like requests and responses and cookies and stuff like that. So earlier, for example, we have the two domains and the subdomains, and the dotted lines around them were the business's decision to overlay some arbitrary technology on that domain and say, yes, all your customer verification issues are going to be solved by this enterprise CRM system. That dotted line is that whole floor of that business using one ERP or something like that, yeah? And one port of the hexagonal architecture was the same kind of thing. So call center is just, that's obviously operated by phones and people. Email is always bound by SMTP because the organisation, that's what they have. And this, for example, it's all HTTP stuff. So boundary contexts for me are first and foremost business oriented, but then they become very, very quickly technology bound. That's what I find anyway. Has anyone else had any experience with boundary contexts and seen that happen? Seen the difference between sort of a business-oriented boundary context where people have been asked to work with certain technologies or certain processes and they're bound to them and they can't seem to work differently. And then you see a boundary context in your code. Has anyone witnessed those sorts of differences? See it quite a lot in the larger organisations where teams are really getting quite annoyed because they've been asked to work with one legacy system and that's their whole boundary context. So it could be a system that makes SOAP calls and never made one REST call. It's just still in XML land, and that's the boundary context. So all of their code is about SACs parsing. And the team get really, really frustrated in that. The boundary context is just XML land, and that's the end of it. Other teams are, as soon as you start talking to them about what their application does, it just persists everything. So their boundary context is all about Oracle or SQL Server. So one portion of this would be, instead of SMTP, would be Oracle, and it would have a customer table. The other side would be SQL Server. So they would be technology specific, not even vaguely, about persistence. They would be specifically Oracle, SQL, etc.
And also if they've got reporting applications that sit on top of, say, Oracle, all of the applications that write into those databases are bound.
They're already bound, aren't they?
To that reporting application in the schemas they have to use and so on. And you find that goes all the way up, and it will pop out at the web as well. You find loads and loads of applications where the URL to address something contains a database ID. And in fact, that's the default way that Rails apps are built. Rails, by definition, every addressable resource, the URL to get to it uses the database ID.
Right. Wouldn't a platform like there are platforms like business objects, remember business objects, those kinds of things, and the cubing platforms, weren't they brought in to try and provide that layer of separation?
No, it causes it.
Causes it?
Yeah.
So but the people were spending like thousands and thousands of pounds on trying to provide this sort of reporting layer, weren't they, to separate it?
That was the 90s. Nobody does anything like that anymore, do they?
What do they do? What would they do now if they...
They're doing ERP.
What do they do? I mean, ERP systems still do. I wouldn't go anywhere near. I mean, I've had to... can you imagine a reporting system having to go through a domain to get what it needs?
I'm having to re-architect a gigantic set of systems exactly like this,
right,
for a multi-billion pound company, and everything is totally constrained by the business reporting software, because all of the applications write to a shared database. So everything is constrained by that one consumer of that data. And we're trying to break it up and introduce event sourcing and have the data that reporting stuff uses just be a view of the set of events. But there's an awful lot of people in that organisation say that's mad.
Sleep point of truth.
So are you seeing boundary context in the work that you do? Or is it something that doesn't really make a difference to what you do? Do you not think about boundary context anymore, or do they not? Because I mean, I see them a lot in what I do, and I sometimes think I'm just inventing the fact that there's something that's constraining my technology choice. But it sounds like you've
It's
tried to...
language choice though, isn't it?
Can be, yeah. I think so.
It's a way of describing the problems you have.
Yeah.
It's not the only one.
Yeah. So there you go. Any other thoughts on bounding context? Any questions?
Do you not domain design for every problem?
No, absolutely not. No. One of the pieces of advice given in a lot of the literature, actually, and I remember coming to a session we had here once, and it was the first thing they mentioned. Which is why I take it for granted, I suppose, now. Is that I try not to see everything in terms of domain and services and commands and stuff like that. And yeah, I don't think about it too much. It takes a long time. It takes really, for me, it takes talking to at least 2 or 3 teams in the organisation to start to build a picture of their bounded context before I begin to think about how to sort of centralise and resolve those differences. Usually what happens is we start building you're building like an integration system or something like that, is it? Because we tend to...
We're trying to do the opposite. We're trying to disintegrate.
Disintegrate. I'd much rather be able to do that. What we tend to end up doing is having messaging systems. As soon as they come in with like event sourcing type things, you have to then get the language right. Because the part of the organisation over here has an investment in that, the way they describe those messages. And you can get a lot of pushback if you start to introduce like a canonical model to say, you may think a customer is that, but did you know that in the other part of the organisation they see the customer very differently? Because they don't really care. They don't really want to do that mapping. So another team ends up doing it and building an integration or a disintegration. So I definitely don't see domain-driven design as that important until it is, and then I don't let it go for a while.
So one thing you've got here, because you've got a domain core with sessions and stuff in it, you've likely got reconnaissance of identity because the different bounded contexts need to reference the same customer session.
Yes.
If you split that up and make it event sourced using CQRS, you replace that with connaissance of type,
which is weaker. Because they only have to.
Because they only have to know. They only have to understand the shape of the events, and then they make their own decisions about what to do with them.
Isn't that like introducing a canonical model for the messages? Similar to that sort of.
Yes, but it's the events become entities in their own right. So everything that uses them is decoupled from each other. So whereas here, because you've got a domain core, everything that uses it is to its view of the world.
Yes, it will do.
Sorry, Kevin, for the Luddites here, what is connaissance?
Oh God,
you're joking.
That's a big thing. How long have you got?
Basically, just for people.
A fancy.
Much fancier. Thank you.
He mentions it every month.
There are 2 people I brought tonight who are new. Hi, Phil.
Just like to say, I've never worked in a company that uses the word connaissance.
Has anybody worked in a company
You
that
should
hasn't been paid?
Yeah, is anyone brave enough to say the word?
Well, I'd say connaissance, but you know.
I'm not sure what
That's a different thing altogether.
So if there aren't any more questions, we'll just leave it there for now. But check in on the repo now and again, because this is going to just be something that I use to practice my domain-driven design skills. And now I'm going to implement something quite funky with I'll have to go to Java 8. My developer friends will not like this.
You can use anonymous in the classes.
Yeah. All right. Okay.
Why can you use anonymous in the classes?
Is that what you do?
Because the amount of noise you have to write in order to do it. You have to create an interface, you have to create an implementation of it.
Yes.
And implementation is a
Well, there's anonymous in the
class.
class, and it's you're just doing the interface, aren't you? So I mean, it's
Yeah, but
syntactically, it's ugly.
Yeah.
I'm quite excited about trying that. Not when I get home, other things to do. Maybe tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right, twisted kind of deviances.
Yeah.
About trying.
I mean, I've got a slight obsession with hexagonal shaped things, but that's not going to change, I'm afraid. So I've learned quite a lot from the show. That was the whole point of this, is that, you know, I hear these little stories, because domain-driven design is still not really being adopted very many places, I don't think, and it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be the first thing you go to.
That's the reason I asked the question. Maybe there are not enough problems with it solved.
The larger organisations, it certainly helped me understand things better. But yeah, I'm not seeing a direct one-to-one, you know, solving of problems with domain-driven design. No,
I work for a
definitely not.
consultancy, and we go all over the country doing projects, delivery projects. Most of the problems are when you go into big organizations, it's the integration of the existing systems. And well, I've not come across a problem that we've worked on yet. Although the principles that it has, like using ubiquitous language and using the domain language inside of software, those principles apply to most of the problems. But strictly speaking, whether you would have a command pattern or you would have event sourcing and the rest of the noise that comes along with it, like CQRS, there's still sort of...
So there's still some things like aggregate routes and how aggregate routes take in commands and so on. That still appeals to me. Sometimes that helps me solve issues because it's kind of asynchronous and in its suggestion. But you know how BDD is often talked about in terms of, you know, please don't focus on the tooling and emphasise the tooling too much, but just really use it as a way to collaborate and communicate. I think domain-driven design really is a way of getting organisations, functions and stuff like that to talk about their own language and just collaborate in a better way, like specification by example. It feels a bit like that for me. So, I mean, I get straight into implementation like this because I want to know whether it's feasible, technically feasible. But in the meantime, different teams are talking to each other because they're thinking about their domains, which I find that really useful. But certainly don't run through all the domain-driven design patterns. I don't think, the last time I wrote a repository, I can't remember.
I think it's probably one of those things where
I don't do stuff like that.
there's maybe not that many places where sort of DDD is kind of used as a whole.
Well, can you imagine if it
kind
was?
of pieces of it, like ubiquitous language is probably fairly ubiquitous. And things like the increased use of events as a first-class idea is probably, you know, increasing. And things like, a lot of the things maybe come up without even being recognised as such. So for example, I've noticed that, again, just to touch on my own experience, like the idea of an aggregate route is very similar to the idea of an actor in the sense that it maintains a boundary of kind of concurrency and sort of
consistency.
It sees events, messages, and it updates itself in a coherent manner. So the idea of an actor and say, oh, actually, there are another system.
That's really good. I mean, the boundary context idea, which I've sort of emphasised here, I steal that all the time because it's the one thing that makes a lot of sense to me, especially when I'm looking at things like the controller problems and things like that. So yes, I do tend to cherry pick stuff from domain-driven design, definitely. I don't know. I can't imagine what it'd be like if you did the whole thing. I think it'd be a bit boring. But, in fact, there's an old code base that we worked on years and years ago, like late rooms, that was, if you looked at the code base and took it for granted, every single idea in there was from domain-driven design.
Implemented badly.
Implemented terribly bad. So that's
somewhere.
Yes. You know, so there are things like so there are repositories and services. But the services have become these technical debt attractors, you know, that are just soaked with technical debt like a sponge because they're just, the behaviours are just, you know, and that's where aggregate routes really help in domain-driven design, I think, because they start to focus business logic, but there's got to be another way of doing that as well. I like the idea of actors. Yes.
So, shall we carry on discussion in the hub, perhaps? Thanks to Matt, and just a reminder about the feedback poll. Everyone, there are only 4 responses from 3 people so far.
So they revised their opinion partway through.
Always win.
And another timely reminder about Tech NW, if you want to go to any of the other events that are going on around the Northwest, that's technw.uk.
Cool.
Have you heard of this thing?
Sorry, I was talking.
Thank you, Matt.